We'll now go to resuming debate, and the honourable member for Beaches, East York.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. And as we live through these difficult times and face the COVID crisis, we have to direct our energies, of course, at the crisis in front of us, but we can't forget about the climate crisis that looms large. And we have to bring that same sense of effort and determination to address the climate crisis. And when we think about addressing that crisis, I think of it through three lenses: ambition, accountability, and action. And this bill before us, Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act, is really about accountability, but also about ambition. I want to start with what is very good in this legislation on ambition, which is the commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, in the last Parliament, I was lucky to join two other colleagues from the Green Party and the NDP to call for a climate emergency debate. In the wake of the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, I introduced a net zero by 2050 bill in the House. I was very happy to see that in our platform, in the throne speech, and now it is realized as a commitment in this legislation. In the purpose clause, the legislation says that the purpose is to promote transparency and accountability in support of achieving net zero emissions in Canada by 2050. And importantly, in the preamble, the IPCC is explicitly cited, whereas the IPCC concluded that achieving net zero GHG emissions by 2050 is key to keeping the rise in the global mean temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and minimizing climate change related risks. Now, of course, 2050 is a long time away, so we need to turn that long-term ambition into short-term practical action, and we do so in the course of this legislation by way of 5-year milestone targets. And that's important. We talked about carbon budgets in our platform, and I think it's important when we get to committee with this bill. Everyone in this House should support this bill to get to committee. But when we get to committee, I'm certainly interested in hearing from experts about the difference between the carbon budget process and the milestone process that our government has proposed. But it is very important that we aren't just talking about net zero by 2050, but we are looking at shorter term milestones and shorter term targets, and that is important ambition. Now, when it comes to accountability, there are a series of measures in this legislation that are important to highlight and that are positive. We first see progress reporting, a requirement of one progress report per milestone at least 2 years before that milestone. We see requirements for assessment reports. We see an important requirement for the government to table an emission reduction plan in Parliament, also table those progress and assessment reports, but to table an emission reduction plan to tell the public how we are going to meet these shorter term targets and how we are going to get to net zero by 2050. We also see an expert advisory body that is to not only advise the minister, but is to annually report to the minister, and the minister must respond in a public fashion. These are important accountability mechanisms. We see annual reports from the finance minister on how the government is taking key measures to manage financial climate risks. And lastly, we see an independent environmental commissioner tasked with examining and reporting on our progress and holding us to account if we fail to meet the necessary progress. Of course, there are challenges. I started with the positives, but let me speak to some of the challenges. And before I get to the challenges, let me say, this is, when I speak of accountability, ambition, and action, this is not an action plan. For anyone looking at this plan and saying, where is the action? You speak about the importance of climate change, where is the action? This is not the action plan. The action plan, we've seen significant action over the last 5 years. And I can get into the details of that. We've seen projected 2030 emissions between 2016 and 2019 go down 25% because of the policies we've put in place. But this is fundamentally about accountability, and it brings with it a commitment to greater ambition. But it also kicks the can down the road too far. And I mentioned turning that longer term ambition into short term action. And while this is a very strong framework for accountability, there is a significant but. And that's because this act, as structured, provides the first milestone target as 2030. And what that means is that the first progress report wouldn't be required until no later than December 31st, 2027. Now, clearly we need a more urgent and credible reporting timeline to meet the Act's goal of transparency and accountability. There are a few ways of answering this challenge, in my view. One, and a number of environmental organizations and colleagues have proposed that we move up the first milestone from 2030 to 2025. Now, that would mean that an initial progress report would be required by the end of 2022, and there is some sense in this, of course, and very smart environmental advocates have called for this solution to address the challenge that I've described. There is another way of addressing this challenge, though, I think, and when we look at science-based ambition, we have a 2050 target in this bill, net zero science-based target from the IPCC in this bill, and we could have a science-based 2030 target in this bill as well. And what does that mean, a science-based 2030 target? Well, we talk about net zero by 2050, but the IPCC also tells us on that pathway to 1.5 degrees that the world needs to be 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. What does that mean in a Canadian context? Well, in 2010, our emissions were 609 megatons. 45% below that is 380. That should be our minimum target. Now, if you look to the Paris Agreement and the fact that we are a highly developed country, we have benefited from, might argue credibly that we actually ought to go further. But at a minimum on the science, the target for 2030 should be 380 megatons. And if we establish that target in a science-based and serious way, then in the course of this act, we could provide for earlier progress reports. And I would certainly be comfortable with a strong science-based 2030 target. If we didn't have a 2025 target, but that strong science-based 2030 target, I would certainly be comfortable with then earlier progress reports in 2030, 2025, 2027. And I think this would be a very, very strong bill. I've heard from other advocates that we could strengthen the advisory body's role in setting targets and in progress reporting. We could better ensure its independence. I've seen suggestions to require the minister to consider expert advice when setting targets. I think there are reasonable questions about capacity issues in the Environmental Commissioner's Office to do this serious work, that if this is the framework that we are looking to in the UK, as an example, the Climate Change Committee, which was established through legislation in 2008, that committee has great resources, and we need to ensure that any independent body that we are standing up to do the accountability job has the necessary resources to do that job effectively. And as I mentioned previously, the difference between milestone targets and carbon budgets are another area that has been raised with me. And all of these considerations, I think, will rightly be addressed by experts at committee. And I sincerely hope that we see proposals from all parties to improve this bill, and there's constructive work at the Environment Committee to improve this bill going forward, because it is a strong framework, but it absolutely does need to be improved. Now, to close, I just want to emphasize that accountability is important, ambition is important, but at all times we must be guided by science. So our ambition must be set by science, and this Accountability Act should be as robust as possible. And then, of course, everything depends upon serious climate action. Let me also say, and I know there are questions about impacts on the economy. This bill in the preamble recognizes actually the importance for the economy of moving towards a clean transition, but this is really about jobs as much as it is about climate action for our kids. Now, we've made significant progress since 2015, so let's, united across party lines, build on that progress. And let's bring, as I say, the same determination and scale of response to the climate crisis that we brought to the COVID crisis. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his speech, and I was initially concerned that his speech would contain unqualified praise for the government, but he stayed on brand and offered some criticisms, and I appreciate that. One of the frustrations for me in our debates about climate change is that I think we spend relatively so much more time talking about targets than about the action that will allow us to move towards those targets. We had a big discussion about, which appropriate targets for what year, but I think we also have to make decisions based on immediate action and trade-offs, and he alluded to some of that. But if I could ask some specific questions in that context, what does he think about supporting the deployment of greater nuclear technology, What does he think about supporting carbon capture and storage within the energy sector? And also, what does he think about doing more to support the development and export of natural gas as an alternative to the continuing use of coal in other countries around the world in conditions that are not up to the level even of coal use here in Canada?
Honourable member for Beaches East York.
So I think there is, speaking from Ontario, there's absolutely a continued role for nuclear, but new investments in nuclear on the math don't seem particularly cost effective. When it comes to carbon capture and storage, every plan that I've seen includes it, but there's no sense of the science of what that means and how we actually realize it. And it's at the moment, there's no credible plan for carbon capture and storage at scale to get us to where we need to get. Now, one thing, just in answer to my friend, on the question about action versus ambition. Of course, we need both. And I mentioned that we've had significant action over the last 5 years and that we need more of it. But we also need the right level of ambition because guess what? The machinery of government moves slowly and it moves towards an end goal. And if we don't get the goal right, then all of that work will have been for naught. As a baseball player for much of my life, if you tell me it's a 5-inning game or a 9-inning game, I manage my bullpen differently. So let's get the innings right.
Question et observation. La députée de
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was a teacher, I often saw students who had problems resolve issues or find solutions to their problems. But when it came time to take action, nothing happened. Why? Because they didn't know how to put in place what they needed to put in place to achieve their objectives. Now, what we're seeing here is that there is no illustration of the means of how they're going to achieve these objectives. Is there a down-to-earth, tangible example of something they can share with us for this bill? The Honourable Member.
So as I mentioned in my comments, this is not an action plan, and nor should it be construed as an action plan. This is, when we talk about ambition, accountability, and action, this is an accountability bill that sets out important ambition that will require the government to act. But this should not be construed as an action plan. But we do know, and I mentioned the UK, but we know when the UK established the Climate Change Act in 2008, which stood up an accountability framework, they have moved much more quickly than we have. Accountability matters.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Victoria.
I want to thank the member for his speech, and from his words, it seems like he cares deeply about addressing the climate change crisis. And it is confusing to me why he would stand behind a bill that puts off accountability for 10 years. It's also confusing because he said that this is not a climate action plan. Well, where is the government's climate action plan? This bill gives the government an additional 9 months after royal assent to create that plan. Yet in their throne speech, they said they would table a climate action plan to exceed 2030 targets immediately. In what definition of immediately is it a year later that we actually get this kind of action plan? How does the member stand behind this Liberal government and their inaction?
You're here. Good question. Well, member for Beaches East York.
This is a frustrating a question in some respects, in that it suggests that there has been no action, where on the actual numbers from Environment Canada, as I mentioned, in early 2016, their report said projected 2030 emissions were 815 megatons. Fast forward to early 2019, that same reporting says 592 megatons. Is it where we need to get? Absolutely not. But for the first time in my lifetime, we've had a government that has acted in a serious way on the most important issue of our time. And so to suggest that we need to stand where we are and do no more is wrong, but to suggest that there has been inaction is equally wrong. And yes, we need to do more, and I mentioned we need to improve this bill, but at second reading, of course I stand behind this bill, and I'm asking for it to be improved at committee.
Question et commentaire. Juste une brève question.
Questions and comments? A brief question virtually. The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and quickly. My colleague is very enthusiastic. He talks about commitment and etc. But there's a group in Quebec that's called Mères au Front, Mothers at the Front, on the front. And they're very concerned about climate change. It's a group of grandmothers. And they have a motto that says, or they urge the government to adopt a consistent action plan to allow them to meet the targets entrenched in the Climate Act. Now, there are some targets in the bill, but if the government's so confident about meeting its targets, why didn't it put the targets in the bill? That's a question from the group that I mentioned.
Well, there is a target in the bill. Is 2050 is net zero by 2050. But as I articulated in my response, I think we should have 2030 and 2050 being the big numbers that we see from the IPCC in terms of timelines, and then 5-year commitments in the interim. Having a 2030, a science-based 2030 target established in this legislation is absolutely something that I would support.